Well, welcome members to a hearing, the work group of transportation. I'm John Kosnick, the transportation chair, and today is Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. We are going to just do an overview with House fiscal staff and House research, and then also as time permits, we expect a presentation with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and some of their transportation priorities. And so I would like to just start by introducing some of our staff. To my left here is Joe Marble, our committee administrator. Our committee legislative assistant is also my LA, Cindy Wallen. Mr. Burris and Mr. Lee will introduce themselves when they do their presentations. I just want to open up with those in the audience here and watching that we expect to pass a transportation bill this year and work efficiently and utilize the revenues that are entrusted to us to utilize transportation systems, and upkeep our transportation system in the modes and the methods that people use the most, and to be more efficient with the tax dollars that are entrusted to us. And then also to maintain the safety of our operations on our roads and transit systems. It's kind of our main priority as a caucus for us. Yep. So I will start, as I mentioned, my name is John Kosnick. I've been on the Transportation Committee for the first 6 terms of my now 11th year in the legislature. I live in Lakeville. I represent the areas of Lakeville, part of Lakeville, Credit River, Elko, Newmarket, and the townships of Newmarket Township and Eureka. We will have some projects that Dakota County's been working on, so I look forward to hearing on that. And I just know that transportation is important for commerce, for people to be able to perform their economic activities, to pay the bills and put food on the table for their families and their businesses. But also, we want to make sure that people can get efficiently to where they need to go. So, Joe, if you want to say a few words, and then I don't know if you do, and then we'll just work our way down that way until we go to the overview.
Joe Marble, I'm committee administrator. I've been with the House since 2007 and been transportation since 2015. Committee administrator for 2015 to 18. So be fun again. Be with y'all.
And I'm Cindy Wallen, and this is my 7th year here, and I'm excited to have put together all these packets for you today.
So my name is Andrew Myers. I represent 11 cities in the West Metro of Hennepin County, and I'm serving my 2nd term and excited to serve on this committee for the first time.
As vice chair.
As vice chair.
State Representative Bjorn Olson from 22A, that's the Fairmont Blue Earth area. This will be my 3rd term on the Transportation Committee, and the chair recently referred to me as a senior member on the committee, which makes me feel really old, maybe a little older than I truly am. Excited to be here.
I'm Representative Marge Fogelman. This is my 2nd term and also my 2nd term on the Transportation Committee. One of the reasons I got into government is because I think roads and bridges are one of our most important things that we need to be taken care of as our government, and I hear a lot about it every time I talk to a constituent. So looking forward to working with everybody again these next 2 years.
Representative Jim Joy, out of 4B, which is Clay County, Becker County, up by Moorhead. This is my 2nd term going in as legislator. This will be my first time on transportation. I sat on taxes and state and local government last year, and I also sit on those again this year with this one. So I'm looking forward to it to get started. Thank you.
Representative Roger Scraba, District 3A. In MnDOT terms, District 1. A big chunk of District 1 is my district. I have 11,700 square miles with a lot of roads, a lot of state roads. I look forward to working with the group. This is my 2nd term, first time on transportation, but we have a lot of transportation issues in Northeast Minnesota, and I look forward to working with people.
Thank you. I'm Representative Patty Anderson, Washington County area. This is my 2nd term in the legislature. I also sit on taxes and the Legislative Audit Commission and now the new Fraud Committee. I have lots of interest in transportation, just from an infrastructure standpoint and a supporter of infrastructure in general. Thank you.
Thank you, members. And Representative Murphy is on his way over, probably hasn't figured out where the new committee room is yet, but we can start. Mr. Lee's going to start first. Is that right? As he makes his way to the testifier presenting table, do want to share with our stakeholders that are here with us. We appreciate that you're here. We're ready to work with you, and I will make a note. Obviously, there's a lot of other questions up in the air in terms of the organization of the House, but I have spoken with Chair Cagle or Representative Cagle, whether she'll be a lead or a representative or a co-chair, however that gets determined later on. But we do intend to work hard together. We understand that we need to pass the transportation bill, and we need to have bipartisan support for that. So we'll see how things play out otherwise, but we're here to get the work done and to get the process going. So we have very capable nonpartisan staff to our members here, as we know from other committees. But these two gentlemen and the work that I've done in transportation for my term here at the legislature, they've been nothing but professional and very knowledgeable. And so we're very lucky to have them with us. And then I'll turn it over to however you guys want to present. Who goes first?
I'll introduce myself. Andrew Lee from House Fiscal Staff, one of the two nonpartisan, or one of the nonpartisan offices here, and I'll turn it over to Matt Burris that will start the presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Matt Burris with House Research, another nonpartisan office here in the House. So to begin, we were asked to provide some overview information about transportation finance. And we'll be covering primarily highways and transit. There are other areas, fiscal areas, but in the interest of time and given some of the intricacies and complexities around these two areas, that'll be the focus today. Certainly available for questions or further discussion in other areas. But I just wanted to note that there are some other aspects of transportation funding beyond what we introduce over the course of this presentation.
And Mr. Burris, just for the members, why don't we let you go through your presentations, and then we can, if you have some questions, get our attention, and we'll do questions at the end. Okay.
Sounds good. So to begin with, we'll start with highway finance. And there should be a packet with these slides included in your committee folder, along with a couple of other handouts that we'll be referring to later on in the course of the introduction, or sorry, into the presentation. So to begin with an introduction, I'll start with a little bit of just high-level welcome to highways. So in Minnesota, there is a system of highways that is under the jurisdiction of a number of different entities, and that includes at the state level administration by the Department of Transportation. That's the state trunk highway system. So trunk highways is the broad term used to describe a number of different highways that include interstates, U.S. highways, and just trunk highways generally. And then there are a number of different further divided systems that are under jurisdiction of local units of government, counties, cities, and towns. Broadly, the funding system for highways, and sorry, actually, I'll back up on one other comment I just wanted to note. In talking about highways here, and as often seen in the statutes, really this is construed broadly to include streets, bridges, kind of all parts of the system. So there's highways in the sense of what you might think of as, the fast-moving, get from city to city, that kind of part of the system. But it's also, the term is used, and how I'm using it here kind of refers to all of the road system at the various levels. So funding for the highways has a couple of features to note at the outset. One is that there's a constitutional framework that underlies how highway finance works. There's statutory and constitutional provisions. So the state law follows from this constitutional framework. And we'll be touching on quite a few, but not all of the formulas that are found in highway finance. A lot of the funding also is outside of the general fund. For general fund appropriations and spending in the transportation area, that's primarily seen in a couple of other areas such as transit and some aspects of Department of Public Safety. So there's certainly general fund involved in transportation funding overall, but as we'll see, a number of the revenue streams don't follow through the general fund. This chart is sort of a flow chart that is intended to provide a general sense of the flow of highway dollars. There are some caveats to this. It's a snapshot for 1 year and is intended as hopefully a visual aid to give a sense of both the sources and some of the collection points and then the allocations of how the dollars flow. This excludes some aspects of the highway funding, particularly for fiscal year 2024, which this shows some amounts for. There were a number of one-time appropriations from the general fund. Those aren't shown here. There are also some significant one-time funding from the general fund for flexible programs. And since that could be allocated to a number of different modes and purposes, that's also not highlighted here. So this is designed more to give a sense of the basic flow and kind of the overarching structure that we'll kind of walk through some of the aspects of. So I mentioned that part of the basis for highway finance is constitutional, and one of the elements of that is creation of the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. So kind of like the general fund, this is an accounting fund of the state, but it's constitutionally established. It's a distinct fund, and it contains the three main traditional sources of highway-related revenue, and we'll be talking about each of those sources in turn. And there's some other revenues that are also directed into this fund, the HUTD as it's called in the acronym-laden transportation world. And then it works sort of like a pass-through. So it's a collection point for some tax revenues, and then there's a constitutionally based allocation formula or a couple of formulas to then determine or dictate where those dollars flow out to. Also established in the Constitution are three other funds, and these, again, are accounting funds of the state. One is the Trunk Highway Fund, and that is established for the state trunk highway system. And then there are two funds for local assistance. One is the County State Aid Highway Fund, or CSAH Fund, and that is for assistance to counties for a portion of the county system. And the Municipal State Aid Street Fund is the equivalent for municipalities, some larger cities. Moving into revenue sources, as I had mentioned, there are three primary sources and then a number of other revenue streams that come out of state taxes. And I'll note that this is a look at this point at the state level of funding. There's also federal funds, which will be touched on, but not in much detail here, as well as regional and local dollars that also go towards transportation. There's a fair amount just at the state level, so that's the focus for introductory purposes, if you will. So the first of these major revenue sources is the motor fuels tax, or the gas tax. The current rate for that is 31.8 cents per gallon, and that's the rate that's imposed for gasoline and diesel. There's a similar rate that's proportional based on the energy content of other types of fuel, such as compressed natural gas, liquid petroleum gas, and so forth. This is the rate that is currently in place as a result of indexing that was first established in 2023 legislation. I'll be referencing some changes from 2023 a number of times. There was one act that made a variety of changes in the realm of transportation finance. One of them was to establish this indexing provision. This, under the constitutional structure, is revenue that goes just to roads through the HUTD. The second revenue source is the motor vehicle registration tax. This is an annual tax imposed on vehicles as part of the registration process to legally operate on Minnesota roads. There's a formula for how that tax is calculated that has some flat dollar as well as a MSRP, or original retail price basis of the vehicle. And that calculation changes over time. As a vehicle ages, the ultimate result of this calculation is that the tax rate reduces. And it drops by some percentage points on annually, like year over year. And then ultimately for older vehicles, for vehicles aged 11 and older, the tax shifts to a flat minimum amount. There are also registration taxes imposed at other rates and based on differing schedules for other types of vehicles. What I was just talking about was for passenger automobiles. So for trucks and various other types of vehicles, there are a couple of different statutory schedules that set out weight and age declining or increasing tax amounts. This too has a constitutional basis, and the dollars go into the HUTD fund. And this is another tax that had been modified in 2023 legislation. The third of the three major tax sources for highways is the motor vehicle sales tax, or MVEST. And this is a sales tax that's imposed on motor vehicle sales. It's imposed instead of the state general sales tax. The rate is now the same following, again, 2023 changes, but the dollars are allocated differently than the state general sales tax. So historically, motor vehicle sales tax had been allocated off and on at different points to transportation. In 2006, a constitutional amendment was adopted by the voters to dedicate the revenue to transportation purposes, but there's further constitutional requirements so that a portion of the motor vehicle sales tax must be allocated to transit, and there's a cap, a minimum for transit and a cap for highways. And we'll be circling back around a little bit to a couple of these a little bit later. A couple of the other revenue sources. The first is a portion of the state general sales tax. This is revenue that's attributed to automotive repair and replacement parts as revenue, a set or a portion, a share of the revenue collection. And this has been allocated partially to transportation in the past. And then in 2023, a phase-in schedule was established to allocate all of this identified revenue to a couple of different transportation targets or recipients. One of those recipients is the HUTD fund that I had mentioned previously, and the other was a new account that was established called the Transportation Advancement Account, or TAA. And this slide shows a phase-in schedule for how that reallocation is set to go in the coming years. So the portion to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund, that percentage stays the same over time. So the growth is directing additional revenue into the TAA and accordingly reducing revenue that currently goes to the general fund. That is a multi-year phase-in. And then touching briefly on some of the other state sales taxes, another portion of the state general sales tax that's related to motor vehicle rentals, short-term rentals, is directed to transportation. There's also a separate tax from that. It's an independent tax, if you will, that is on motor vehicle rentals that's imposed at a 9.2% rate. So sometimes you might see reference in some documents to vehicle rental tax 6.5%. And that refers to the general sales tax where the revenue comes out of vehicle rentals. And then there's the rental tax, which is a separate tax, that's the 9.2%. So I don't know if that will help set you up for future documents, or if not, I'm certainly happy to go over it again at a later date. Another portion of the general sales tax is imposed on motor vehicle leases, and this is sometimes referred to as the motor vehicle lease sales tax. This is also allocated to transportation purposes. Largely, these allocations are a function of changes that have been made in 2017. And then another more recent revenue stream is the retail delivery fee. This was also established in 2023 legislation. It's a 50-cent charge on delivery of, in general, tangible goods that are purchased from a retailer. So the imposition of this is similar to the state general sales tax, but there are some modifications, both additions and exceptions in comparison to the state general sales tax. And again, the trigger is both whether it's something that's taxable, but also there being a delivery aspect to it. One thing to note with that flow chart at the outset, it has a box that just highlights that the retail delivery fee is one of the streams, but this collections or this tax didn't actually commence until July 1st of 2024. So that's actually fiscal year 2025. All of the information, all the fiscal data in that flow chart and data that is being shown in a couple subsequent slides are for fiscal year 2024. So put another way, revenue from the delivery fee hadn't started coming in for the fiscal 24 data that's being shown in some of these slides. But that is anticipated and coming for fiscal 25. Another aspect just to touch on briefly for transportation funding and finance is state bonding. So this is a bit different from a revenue source. You can think of it that way, but I'd also encourage thinking of it in terms of it being a debt financing mechanism for funding transportation projects sooner than would otherwise be able to occur. But there is a debt aspect to it. So debt service is then going to be a necessary element in future years. So there are a number of limitations and requirements that drive bonding in general. And I won't go into much detail, but I'll just highlight a distinction in two of the various types of bonds. So trunk highway bonds are for the trunk highway system. And they're a form of general obligation of the state, but there are some distinct aspects to it under constitutional requirements. And that is distinct from just GO bonds in general. And that's what we kind of think of generally as the legislation that's found in the bonding bill. And those GO bonds can be used for various other types of transportation capital projects, local roads, transit facilities, and so forth. So there is a distinction in the type of bonds. Ultimately, both GO bonds and trunk highway bonds are debt, but the repayment is from different sources. The legislation for bonding really has a fair amount of year-to-year variability. In some years, there's not legislation enacted authorizing additional bonds. And from year to year, there's some variation in trunk highway bonding being authorized in the transportation finance bill or in a capital investment bill. This chart just provides a little bit more context or sense of around transportation-related bonding, showing a distribution between these types of bonds over a 10-year period. And then next, just rounding out the discussion of funding sources, some amounts are shown from the various sources that I touched on in a chart here. One thing I'll just note is that The general fund other category includes various sources, some of which are related to a number of different trunk highway fund revenue streams. And again, this chart excludes some of the general fund appropriations that are one-time that I mentioned earlier. Shifting to where the money then goes, again, at a high level, it's a constitutional framework that sets out the basis for distributing funds. And as I mentioned earlier, the revenue that goes into the highway user tax distribution fund then flows out into those three core highway-related funds. The way that it flows has a couple of pieces to it. First, there's a split of a 95% and a 5% of the dollars that are in the highway user tax distribution fund. That 95% goes by constitutional formula to state highways as well as county and municipal road systems. So those are the percentages shown on this chart, and the dollars that as a result go to the CSA fund and the Municipal State Aid Street Fund and the Trunk Highway Fund. The other piece of the flow is that 5%, and this is sometimes called the set aside or the 5% set aside. And there's a bit of flexibility on how this is allocated and is set in state statutes. There's some limitations on the frequency of the change. It's been a number of years since this has been modified. So currently, the formula directs a portion of the dollars into town roads and town bridges and a portion into a flexible highway account. And in practice, that flexible highway account has been used for turnbacks, which are dollars used to as part of the jurisdictional change of a road system. For instance, shifting a trunk highway to instead be part of a county highway system, and the dollars are used to either bank towards or implement reconstruction or work to get the road up to current standards and conditions. So of the dollars that flow into the state aid, the two state aid funds, those then flow out to the counties and the larger cities. This primarily is in the form of aid that goes to the various counties and cities. There are some chunks that are set aside for disaster and research, a couple of different statutorily identified purposes. And there are further formulas for the allocation both among the counties as well as among the cities. And there are a couple of different components to each of those formulas. I touched on this earlier. The motor vehicle sales tax has a constitutional basis for its allocation. And the formula for how the motor vehicle sales tax revenue is distributed is shown in this table. And you can see from that a portion goes to highways through the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And then there are portions, percentages that go to transit in the Twin Cities metropolitan area and transit in greater Minnesota. Incidentally, I think I neglected to mention earlier, there are a couple of motor vehicle sales tax or MVEST amounts shown in past charts, and those are just the highway portions, just in case you're wondering about how the dollars add up here. Another piece of the distribution is the various state sales taxes. A number of them go into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. For the auto parts, we had talked a little bit about the phase-in with additional dollars over time going into the new Transportation Advancement Account. And then motor vehicle lease sales tax has a separate allocation formula, and that is shown on this table. A portion going to Greater Minnesota Transit, a portion going to some of the counties in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, as well as dollars for bridges and another stream going into the HETD fund. So that was a fair amount with some highlights around the constitutional and statutory aspects that drive transportation or highway finance. And so just to recap a bit more on that. So there are a couple of core state sources from tax revenue that are related to highway activities. There's funding flow primarily into three major funds. There are quite a few formulas that then allocate the dollars out to various state and local recipients. And the general fund dollars on the highway side of transportation finance has been fairly limited overall. And with that, we'll move into the transit section of the presentation.
Yeah, maybe at the break here between road funding and then before transit, if any members have any questions. Otherwise, we can just continue to go. Nobody's on the list, so. Okay, well, thank you. Let's go to the transit part.
Okay, and moving on to transit. So whereas highway finance is much more prescribed in terms of constitutional restrictions of both sources and uses, transit finance has one constitutionally restricted and prescribed source. That's the thing that Mr. Burris alluded to earlier, the motor vehicle sales tax. But most of the rest of transit finance has evolved differently from highway finance in that it is not the state providing the service as MnDOT is providing trunk highways, but rather the state has an arm's length relationship in terms of funding local units of government providing transit service. And even though it isn't as have as many constitutional restrictions, it is still almost as complicated as highway finance. So moving on to who's providing transit service in Minnesota. So as I mentioned, local governments provide the service. This is an evolution off of oftentimes private transit owners and companies from the 19th century through to the 1950s and 60s, becoming insolvent and often bought out by local units of government in the 60s and 70s. And since then, transit is sort of a quasi-enterprise function of local units of government. In the Twin Cities metropolitan area, the largest provider of transit is the Metropolitan Council through an operating division called Metro Transit, but also through contracted services where the Metropolitan Council contracts with a private vendor to provide the service both for regular route bus service and for ADA paratransit service known as Metro Mobility. In the metro area, there's also a few other providers outside of the Metropolitan Council service area that are commonly known as the suburban transit providers. Sometimes people refer to them as the opt-outs. And the University of Minnesota also runs a shuttle bus service between its two campuses. Outside the metro, there's about 35 transit systems of varying sizes and with different service structures and coverage areas. And on the next slide, and this came out a little small in the slide deck, there's a map of those service jurisdictions. But the presentation is online if you want a more zoomed-in version of this map. So two distinct ways that the state interacts with transit finance. There's direct appropriations, which is what you see in omnibus finance bills where the dollar amount is spelled out, the source and the use, and where those budgets are approved every 2 years. And then there's statutory appropriations, where in statute the legislature has named a source that then goes to the use without the legislature appropriating the dollars. Sometimes those are called open appropriations or ongoing spending authority. Then moving to the next slide. And a further distinction within transit finance, there's often discussion or requests for operating versus capital funding. Operating being to maintain the transit service delivery, and then capital for expansion, maintenance activities, or transit fleet replacement. And they can have different funding streams attached. So this is a brief overview of the major revenue streams for transit. For the federal government, there's multiple programs that transit providers apply for. Some are specific to operating, some are specific to maintenance, and some are specific to capital projects. Then the state has both direct and statutory appropriations. So there's a general fund appropriation for both Greater Minnesota Transit and Metro Area Transit. And then there is regional and local taxes, some of which are imposed by counties, and one of which in the metropolitan area is imposed by the state. And then there is revenue that's generated by the system, which is what I mentioned earlier, that this is a quasi-enterprise function that's fare box revenue, advertising, and things like that. So quick overview of state sources. So as mentioned, a portion of the motor vehicle sales tax, 40% of the total, goes to transit, and that's by constitutional, by a statutory formula. And then within that 40%, 34.3 is for metro area transit and 5.7 is for Greater Minnesota Transit. And those percentages changed a little bit in the 2023 transportation bill. Then there's the general fund direct appropriation for both Met Council and Greater Minnesota Transit agencies that is administered through the Department of Transportation, or MnDOT. And then there's the motor vehicle lease sales tax revenue. Of the total, 38% of that goes to Greater Minnesota Transit. And then with general obligation bonding bills, there's a history of those funding transit projects or programs, but they tend to be called out and specified in the bonding bill, unlike just direct aid appropriations. So on the next slide, this is a breakdown of state resources for Greater Minnesota Transit. You can see almost 60% is from the motor vehicle sales tax. Then the next largest amount is 27% from the motor vehicle lease sales tax, and then a general fund appropriation that takes up about 16% and is around $15 million a year. On the next slide, looking at the metro area now, one of the changes in the 2023 transportation bill was a 0.75% state-imposed sales tax on the metropolitan area. That's the 7 counties of the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And it was the allocation formula of receipts from that tax is 83% to the Metropolitan Council, largely for transit, which generates, or in fiscal 2024, about $264 million, and then 17% to the Twin Cities metro area counties. So the larger of those two pots to the Metropolitan Council, of that, 95% was for transit operations, maintenance, and capital, and a few other specified purposes, and 5% was for active transportation type programs. Then continuing on with the regional sales tax, the amount, the 17% to the metro area counties, of that allocation to each county, 41.5% each for active transportation and safety studies, and then transportation system repair and maintenance and roadway work. And so that could be broadly transit or roads. And then 17% for transit, complete streets, or greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. Moving to the next slide, the Metropolitan Council also imposes a region-wide or a subset of the region property tax. This is a holdover from when the transit system was taken into public hands The regional-wide or property tax of the cities served by that transit system was established to pay for operating expenses. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, most of that property tax went away and was instead substituted with the motor vehicle sales tax and the state general fund appropriation, but a subset remained to pay for bonds that are specific to fleet replacement. So this is mostly replacing buses. And on the next slide, there's a map of the taxing district for transit there. And I should note on the next slide that the bonds that the Metropolitan Council issues that this tax pays off, that's mostly for bus replacement and other capital maintenance activities, is authorized by the legislature, sometimes in annual, sometimes in biannual authorizations, and also is used to match federal aid for bus replacement. There's a subset of the Twin Cities metropolitan area in that transit jurisdiction where there are non-Metropolitan Council transit providers that I mentioned earlier, the suburban transit providers. And this is a map. You can see in the lower area is the Minnesota Valley Transit Authority. In the southwestern area is aptly named Southwest Transit. And then in the north is Plymouth and Maple Grove, which runs their other services. This is a pie chart and a breakout of the major sources of the Metropolitan Council's operating revenue. So you can see the motor vehicle sales tax, that's that constitutionally dedicated and statutorily allocated amount, is about 42%. Then state appropriations are 14%. The regional sales tax accounts for about 19% of those sources, and this is just of what the Metropolitan Council is intending to spend in calendar year 2025. And then the property tax, the federal funds, passenger fares, and other. So moving on to the next one. So in addition to the state-imposed 0.07 or 0.75% sales tax, counties have the option to levy up to 0.5% and a $20 vehicle excise tax for transportation in general. I believe each of the metropolitan counties do this, but some are at levels lower than 0.5%, and it can be used for either roads or transit. And another local source of transportation and specifically transit revenue are county regional rail authority property tax levies. And again, this is voted on by county boards. And typically the regional rail authority is the county commission or the commissioners of the county. In the metro area, it's historically been used for transitway operating costs, specifically in Hennepin County light rail and also Ramsey County. And there is a restriction that no more of that property tax levy stream can go, or that can account for more than 10% of the capital costs of a transitway project. So a quick recap of the sources for transit, and so you can see a varied stream of federal, state, regional through the Met Council, county, and then county regional rail authority. So that I'm done with transit, and before moving on to budgets, would you like me to pause for any questions?
Representative Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one. I was trying to get, the transit, I was looking at finance by source, and I know that the new sales tax is about 300 million, and I'm sure it's in here, but you know off the top of your head, the dollars that go into the Met Council for transit that are not part of that sales tax, so I can kind of compare how much additional the sales tax added. Thank you.
Yes, certainly.
Julie?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think I can get you the numbers offline a little bit quicker and in a better table, but yeah, the pieces that aren't the sales tax that go to the Metropolitan Council is motor vehicle sales tax and a general fund appropriation, and I can get those numbers to you pretty quickly, so.
Ms. Anderson?
Thank you,
Representative
Mr.
Anderson?
Chair. And one more question that maybe you can get to the committee. you said that the motor vehicle sales tax percentages changed in the '23 session. I'm sure it was in the bill that I never saw that. But I'm just, maybe you could give us the information for what it was before that to the committee. Thank you.
Mr. Lee?
Certainly, Representative, before the 2023 bill, the percentage for MVEST was 60% roads, and that hadn't changed. But then 4% Greater Minnesota Transit and 36% metro area transit. And so the metro area amount decreased and the Greater Minnesota amount increased.
And Mr. Lee, could you give us just a little bit of overview or a little bit more detail on how federal funds in the state get here? How consistent are they? What can we plan for? What the state currently has or in the purview of this budget cycle?
Certainly, Representative Koznick, the federal funds, there's a number of different programs that I can follow up with all the list of the programs that the federal funds. So they're applied to by the transit operator. The state, I don't believe that either that MnDOT applies for them directly, but either Greater Minnesota Transit Operators or the Metropolitan Council apply to the federal government. There's a few that are specific to operating, which is largely Greater Minnesota Transit, and then there are ones that are all transit systems for capital replacement, so bus replacement. That's what the regional property tax levy mostly matches. And then there's the higher profile one called the New Starts Grant Program, which is for large capital expansion. And so that's what the Metropolitan Council has applied for the major light rail lines, the commuter rail line, and the smaller version of New Starts, small starts for some bus rapid transit. And so it's the Metropolitan Council that applies for those.
Thank you. What about federal dollars for roads and bridges on that side of it?
Do you want to?
And I'm sorry we can follow up later too if if you want. But if you have some comments, just generally.
Yes, similarly, there's a wide number of programs and therefore funding streams federally. Some of those are allocation-based, so it's kind of like formula dollars that go to the state. Quite a bit of the federal highway money, actually the vast majority of it flows to the Department of Transportation, and then there's a further allocation. The department has set up policies to allocate a portion of those dollars to local road projects. And there are also discretionary programs, so that's, dependent on application and award of various grants for, bridge or, major highway projects.
Mr. Burris, is most of the federal dollars then on the road side, like project specific then, or?
I'd say, Representative Koznick, that the most of the dollars are more flexible. And so MnDOT has a fair amount of discretion and latitude in and does a fair amount towards allocating use of available federal dollars across a number of projects. Typically in the past, MnDOT has tried to, kind of put a lot of the federal dollars towards trunk highway work in order to sort of do some balancing that arguably has the effect of helping locals with not needing to meet some of the federal requirements that go along with federal aid. But there's a fair amount of flexibility, I'd say, overall with using federal dollars towards a variety of projects.
Okay, thank you. We can continue to move on. We're going to continue to move on.
And then, Mr. Chair, moving on to the budget. So the transportation area jurisdiction has included the Department of Transportation. So that is down here, the trunk highway system, basically everything labeled with either a U.S. highway shield, an interstate highway shield, or the Minnesota route number. Local road aid, so that's county state aid, highway aid, municipal state aid streets, and then revenue from the motor vehicle lease sales tax and general fund sources. Then active transportation has been a general funded item at the Department of Transportation. Aeronautics, which is a separate stream of aeronautics-related taxes, the air flight property registration and fuels tax, and that goes to airport aid, and then other roads, or other modes that have been in past bills, including freight activity and passenger rail activity. Then the Metropolitan Council, part of that has been under the Transportation Committee's area of jurisdiction, and with the general fund appropriation, but also allocation of the motor vehicle sales tax and the regional transportation tax. And then a piece of the Department of Public Safety, which we haven't got into here because we've been focused on roads and transit, but that's also been within the transportation area jurisdiction. So that is the State Patrol, which is an appropriation historically out of the Trunk Highway Fund. Driver and vehicle services, so that is the state division that deals with all of the driver's license, vehicle title transactions, and has a relationship with local and private deputy registrars, and that's a largely fee-based structure of finance there. And then a few other divisions within the Department of Public Safety, the Central Office and Administrative Functions, the Office of Traffic Safety, and the Office of Pipeline Safety. So moving on to the spreadsheet, which should be in your packet. It's a legal size piece of paper that looks like this. And I won't go through line by line, but just to sort of orient you of what these look like. So on the left-hand side, you can see the area, like the appropriation area. So starting with the Department of Transportation, the first few appropriations have to do with aeronautics. You can see in the next column from the left-hand side, the fund. So you can see aeronautics fund is air, general fund is gen, and then you'll see trunk highway fund mentioned here. So just really quickly to orient you, this was the 2023 Transportation Omnibus Bill spreadsheet. So these numbers correspond with the direct appropriations that are in that were in the chapter law. Moving down to page 2, you can see the general fund transit appropriation on those first few lines, then various other general fund appropriations, Transportation Management Organization, Safe Routes to School, and Passenger Rail. Then on page 3, you can see the freight rail appropriations. And I should also note that the descriptors that you see in italics are change items. So a bill will start with a base that's, so on page 3, if you look at lines 77 and 78, that would be the base appropriation levels from the general fund and trunk highway fund. And then there's various change items that can be requested by the governor or proposed by the House or the Senate. And then on page 3, you start to see the appropriations for the Department of Transportation relating to state roads. So you can see operations and maintenance on line 212. So for the last biennium, that's about an $839 million appropriation. Moving to the next page, these are all the big state road appropriations. So you can see planning and research, program delivery, that's the part of MnDOT that does engineering, property acquisition, and those functions of the agency. And then the largest appropriation in the transportation area starts on line 138, and you can see it on line 150, is about a $2.3 billion a biennium appropriation for state road construction. There's an appropriation for corridors of commerce. Then on the next page, you can see trunk highway debt service. So that's paying trunk highway dollars for previously authorized trunk highway bonds, radio communication, and then you can see the appropriations for local roads So you can see the county state aid appropriation, the municipal state aid street appropriation, and then on the next page, other local roads. And then on page 7, you can see the agency management appropriation. That's the central office features of MnDOT. And buildings are down on the bottom of page 7. And you can see the total MnDOT appropriations on page 8. And then the Metropolitan Council General Fund appropriations. So you can see one for transit system operations, and then one specific for metro mobility. And then on the next few pages, and I won't go through in as much detail on these are the appropriations for the Department of Public Safety. So when budget bill times comes along, you'll be seeing spreadsheets similar to this, but that's just to kind of orient you to what the spreadsheet looks like.
And members, I'll just let you know, we can revise and go a little bit more deeper in the spreadsheet as time allows in the future, but that's just to give you an overview of where some of the accounts are. Does that conclude your portions?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer questions, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Representative Scraba, you had a question previously?
On budgets, On budgets, you have other divisions, activity, administrative, office of traffic safety, office of pipeline safety. Is there an office for railroad safety, or is it separate from that? Sorry, Chair.
Mr. Lee?
Yes, Rep. Chair and Representative Scraba, the rail inspectors are under the Department of Transportation, and I'll try to find the
That's,
appropriation.
that,
Representative Scraba?
yes, sorry, Chair. There was one other quick question that I had there. Chair, I have the aeronautics. When FAA gives money, and it gives money to the state, and it gives money to airports, does the state have money from the fuel tax that the state collects for airport projects?
Mr. Lee?
Representative Koznick and Representative Scraba, yes. The three major aeronautics taxes are used by the state for federal matching and for to get money out the door to local airport authorities.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Was there anybody else? Thanks for that presentation. These guys, gentlemen, do a fantastic job and are available to us as a great resource for the committee members. Thank you for your presentation and time today. I want to try to keep us on schedule, and since we did get a little bit late start. Mr. Graves, if you still have time and desire, we would love to hear a little bit of the thoughts from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and Transportation, and from my very first term, Mr. Graves was very helpful on my time in transportation as a freshman, both on the committee and in the legislature. So since it's kind of chamber day, we got the chamber session, priority session dinner tonight. I thought it would be helpful for our members to just hear a little bit from you, sir. So please introduce yourself and share with us some of the priorities, that information that you'd like to share with the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Bentley Graves. I'm with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to come and speak with you all today and share a little bit about the Chamber's priorities as it relates to transportation. We have been very deeply engaged in transportation policy and discussion at the Capitol for a very long time. And that's because it is a critical source for economic competitiveness for our members and the state at large. We are a statewide organization. We represent more than 6,000 employers across the state. We have members that are in every industry, representing the state's economy, every corner of the state, and every size of business. We also work very closely with our network of local chamber partners. There's probably about 140, 150 local chambers spread out across the state, but there's about 50 of them that are part of the chamber's federation that work very closely with us on the chamber's policy priorities and those that advance the interests of the business community, many of which I think are partners with you in your home districts. I was asked by the chair to share just a little bit about the chamber's transportation approach to transportation policy and why it is that we engage in this subject matter. And the reason is pretty simple. Minnesota businesses rely on a safe, reliable, multimodal transportation system to get their goods to market and to get their consumers and their inputs to their door. We tend to take a fairly high-level approach to transportation policy. As I said, we have members in local chambers spread out across the state who, are experts on their local economies, their local needs, their regions, and we defer to them very much on questions about infrastructure investment, whether a bridge here, a roundabout there, a transit investment there. We try to stay at kind of the 30,000-foot level and really do our best to advocate for the state's transportation system as a whole. And one of the places we've spent a good bit of time doing that these last several years has been working to diversify the state's transportation funding sources, specifically looking for opportunities to bring more dollars into transportation from the general fund, from those transportation-related dollars that are collected by the state in some way, shape, or form, and making sure that those dollars find their way to transportation, because we know that there is always a need for greater investment. We know even with the significant input of dollars from the state in 2023 and the federal government in the last federal funding bill, MnDOT projects that the state will come up about $1 billion short over the next 20 years. And so we have made the case for many years that the general fund should be a bigger piece of the solution to funding transportation over the long haul. We're very pleased to see the full dedication of the auto parts sales tax revenue to transportation. Although, as was shown earlier, that is going to be phased in over time, we believe it's an important step that ensures that we have another funding source at the table that will grow over time to help support the ongoing needs of the system. In addition to that, we have for a number of years, and this may come as a surprise to some, but we have for a number of years encouraged the legislature to think seriously about how electric vehicles are going to contribute to the system over time. This is an issue that likely is not going to go away. The policy heft behind the movement towards electric vehicles and the consumer sentiment seem to be moving in that direction, maybe slower than once upon a time, but nevertheless moving in that direction. And so our encouragement to the legislature has been for many years to figure out how electric vehicles are going to contribute meaningfully to the system over time. We do have, since 2017, a $75 registration fee that electric vehicles pay, and that is certainly a good start, but I think most would agree that likely falls well short of what your average person pays in gas taxes a year. We are largely agnostic about exactly how the state does that. There are ideas about some sort of mileage-based user fee for electric vehicles, or maybe looking at some way to levy a tax or fee on the electricity going to charge the vehicles. There are upsides to both of those approaches and challenges with both. But nevertheless, in 2023, when the legislature pulled about every lever there was to pull to increase funding for transportation, this was one that was left on the sidelines. And our hope is that there is some good, reasonable bipartisan work this session and the years ahead to figure out how that piece is going to fit going forward. Because ultimately, the reason to do so, I think, is relatively clear, but the pain point in figuring out how that's going to work is only going to grow over time as the size of the fleet grows. So those are a couple ways in which we've encouraged the legislature and policymakers to think about diversifying the funding streams going into transportation. But we have also really put our shoulder behind the plow in working with the department and others in trying to make sure that the dollars going into the system are used as efficiently as possible. So currently, for about the last 10 years, MnDOT has been statutorily required to track its work on finding efficiencies in the projects it delivers. And it has successfully, to this point, totaled up about over $800 million in efficiency savings. And that is, I think, just a remarkable thing that the department deserves a lot of credit for. One of the ways, though, that we think that work can be strengthened further is working with the department to ensure that we have some sense of where those dollars saved are being invested in this system. There have been times in the past where MnDOT has taken efficiency savings and moved projects up the list to get them done sooner. But more often than not, what we see from the department in the reporting around their efficiency savings is just a reference to those savings kind of being absorbed in the larger construction program. And while I think that is absolutely true, and I think it has helped the department stretch dollars and move projects further faster, we nevertheless think that there's more that could be done to really make those dollars real and really make those savings real. And so that's something we've started a conversation with both Chair Kosnick and Representative Cagle and their colleagues on the Senate side. But that's something that we may be bringing back this session for a little more discussion with you. In that kind of that realm of making sure that we're using dollars as efficiently as possible, we also back in 2021 were part of a group that encouraged the legislature to set aside $1 million in general fund money to help the Department of Transportation build a freight network optimization tool, and that is something that I think has real promise for helping to ensure that on the public side of transportation funding that we're getting the best bang for the buck for dollars invested in our freight network around the state. But also, as we've seen in other states and other localities that have used this kind of optimization tool and technology, it can be a real boon on the economic development side as well, helping businesses understand, where they can get the biggest bang for their buck, whether expanding or locating in Minnesota to make sure that their supply chain needs are met. And then finally, also opening up probably greater opportunities for an understanding of potential for public-private partnerships. Iowa leveraged this kind of technology and this type of analysis to bring both private and federal dollars to the table to make investments in their intermodal infrastructure in the state. So that is the freight network optimization tool is currently being built right now by that department. Their goal is to have that complete by June. And we're looking forward to that being complete and looking forward to working with all of you, working with the department, working with folks in the economic development space and elsewhere in the private and public sectors to really leverage this tool in a way that, like I said, helps ensure that Minnesotans are getting the most for the dollars that they're investing in the system. Two more things I'll touch on quickly, and then happy to open up to questions. From a policy perspective, we have also been looking for opportunities to encourage Minnesota to move further down the path of exploring the possibilities with connected and autonomous vehicles. And the department, again, to its credit, has done a good bit of work with its connected and autonomous vehicle office. I think they have done good work in attracting interest to Minnesota about how that technology might be tested and deployed here. And frankly, our ask of the legislature and all of you is simply to keep an open mind with regard to this technology. Our members, as we talk to them about this, want to make sure that as this technology develops and deploys, that Minnesota isn't left behind, that Minnesota is a hospitable place for folks to come and try this technology and perfect it, and maybe leverage some of the things that are unique to Minnesota, not the least of which is our climate, to really refine this technology and make sure that, like I said, if and when the opportunity arises, that Minnesota is in a position to capitalize. And then finally, there was a good bit of discussion here at the legislature last year with regard to fuels policy. And at the end of the day, what our ask is of policymakers in this space is to keep a close eye on the market implications of fuel policy decisions and the cost considerations of fuel policy decisions. So, looking at something like a low carbon fuel standard, which is something that's been discussed here in Minnesota for the last couple of years, there is yet to be a really solid cost benefit analysis done about what that would look like in Minnesota. The best we can do is look to other states that have implemented policy like this, one of which being California. And if we look at the way in which the proposal was brought in Minnesota and what we can learn from how that's played out in Minnesota, it would likely lead to a 50-cent increase in the price of gas in just the first few years alone and go up from there. And for our members in a state like Minnesota, where we have the highest corporate income tax, we have the sixth highest personal income tax, and the cost of doing business is high. The cost of fuel is actually one of the places where we are kind of middle of the pack nationally. And so when we start talking about fuels policy, that would take that cost input, which is a major input for commerce in the state, and ratcheting it up and putting it in the list of things where we top the nation as a cost input. There are real concerns with that. So I'll maybe leave it there. I'll pause. I know we're coming up on time. I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to come and provide high-level comments here today. If there are any questions, happy to answer them. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, we're just right up, and I know members have other committees and other meetings, so we will have Mr. Graves around quite a bit. He'll reach out to you. But I also just want to, first off, we failed to introduce our researcher, Mr. Brill. If you just quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll make some closing comments before we adjourn.
My name is Justin Brill. I will be the House GOP partisan researcher this session.
Thank you, and he did great work on some of the other committees that I was on last year. So to the stakeholders watching and in the room here, please reach out to all our staff on priority issues that you have to help us understand those issues. And in the future, we will be welcoming other stakeholders to help us, to testify and share some of your thoughts and stuff. So it's just kind of chamber day today, so I picked on Mr. Graves. So I appreciate everybody being here today. We will be meeting next Monday is Martin Luther King Day, so we won't be meeting that day. But the following, a week from today, is Wednesday, January 22nd, here in the same room, 1 p.m. We will have our next meeting, and with that, we will be adjourned.
We're 2:40.